Okay. First of all, let me say that this doesn't always happen when people get abducted. This is kind of like in the minority. We've all heard stories about people being abducted, their eggs taken, their sperm taken, whatever, and then hybrid babies being born, that type of thing. But sometimes it happens, I think, just for romantic involvement or for whatever purposes the aliens might have research. And in this particular case, though, it was an interbreeding program. This is Antonio Villas Boas, and it occurred in 1957. There was a large UFO flap over Brazil. He was just a little Brazilian farmer, and he began to notice UFOs around his home about 2 weeks before this happened. One night, a real bright white light came to rest above his house, and the house apparently had holes in the roof, and the light shone into the house. And then the next day, he was in the field, and he saw a red cartwheel-type object, and when he would try to go towards it, it would fly away. It wasn't very big. And then eventually, he did see a regular UFO that looked like a tortoise, he said, flying above the field where he was working. It landed, and as soon as it got close enough to land, his tractor engine stalled and went totally out. And then the landing legs came down about 5 feet tall, 4 of them, and they were wearing looked like astronaut suits with the helmets and everything over their face. And they dragged Antonio inside the ship. They took him to a room and stripped all his clothes off. Then they sponged him down with this kind of purple liquid. They also did some blood tests on him and some other medical examinations. And then eventually they dragged him off to a room and shoved him inside. And all that was in there was a kind of a low couch. And then they put this gray gas in the room. And Antonio got real sick. He couldn't breathe. He got nauseous. And then he finally threw up, and after he threw up, he said he did feel better. Well, the door opened up, and this little woman comes in, and she's about 4.5 feet tall, and she had real white skin, real white hair, real slanted eyes, blood red pubic hair, and underarm hair. And she made sexual advances to Antonio, and he apparently liked her, and they did have intercourse several times. And he said that after it was all over with, she pointed at her belly, she pointed at him, and then she pointed up at the sky. Then she left the room. They finally came and brought Antonio his clothes. They took him around the spacecraft and showed him all the way it works and everything that was in it. And he saw something that looked to him like a clock on the wall. He tried to take it, but they angrily prevented him. Now, one thing I thought was interesting, the whole time that Antonio was inside the ship, the males never removed their space suits or took off their helmets. And I think one of the purposes of the gas that came into that room might have been so she could breathe while she was in there with him with nothing on. But eventually they did let Antonio go. Now, Antonio got very ill after this encounter, and he had radiation burns and radiation sickness. And he wasn't going to tell anyone about it, but he finally did tell his mother because she kept wondering what was wrong with him, why he was so sick. And they took him to a hospital, and a doctor, Alvin, I hope I'm saying that right, took over his case, and they wondered how he got radiation sickness when he's just a Brazilian farmer, didn't have access to anything that would cause radiation. And he did have to have a lot of treatment, and eventually the Brazilian military came and wanted to know why he had radiation sickness. And American ufologists heard about the case, and some of them flew over there and interviewed him. He was given lie detector tests and passed every one of them, and they do believe that this is a very valid case of alien abduction and sexual encounter. Well, he never tried to make any money off of this either. Now we're going to go on to the next one. involved in attractive co-ed, and this happened in 1970 in Wisconsin. This young lady was going to college. She was out necking with her boyfriend and apparently got pretty aroused. And then all of a sudden, this UFO flies over the car. She got real upset. So upset she started crying and said she wanted to go back to the dorm. Back to the dorm, and they spent the last moments together in the car, and he thought everything was okay. He left. She went inside and got in her bed, put her gown on and everything, got into bed, and then she felt something pulling her down the end of the bed by the ankle and pulling her gown up. So she looked, and there was this hideous, hairy, man-like creature, no mistaking what he had in mind for her. So she couldn't scream. She was in a state of paralysis. And that's another common thing that abductees say, is that when all this is going on, they're in a state of paralysis. The only thing she could do was think, so she started thinking, God, please save me. And she said at that moment, a bright white light flashed at the ceiling and he disappeared. And apparently, they do like college co-eds, because there's a number of cases that I talked about in my book where this would happen. First, the girl would see a UFO, be followed by one or whatever, and then some of the attacks that occurred, the alien or whatever it was that tried this, was invisible and they couldn't see anything. But sometimes there would be traces the next day in the bed that something had happened, or the victim finds themselves naked when they went to bed with their clothes on, or something that made them think that this happened. On to the next one. I've talked about this one before for the people that have been here before. This one involves the case, I can't tell you the woman's real name, but I call her Susan B. in the book. And this is somebody that my husband interviewed a few years ago. A friend of his ran across her in a truck stop. She's a waitress, and they were talking about some scientific things that had to do with hyperdimensional physics and nested tetrahedrons, sacred geometry, that type of thing. And she came over and started telling them how she knew all about that kind of stuff, and they were like real surprised. Well, they said, well, how do you know about all this stuff? And she said, because I'm having an affair with a reptilian, and that he has taken me up in his spacecraft and allowed me to fly it, and I know how it works. He showed me how it works, and it has to do with nested tetrahedrons and hyperdimensional physics. And my husband did build some nested tetrahedrons after that, and they have determined that you can go hyperdimensional with that configuration. Well, what happened in this case was she started seeing a white light outside of her bedroom window, and it would be over the woods. And then one night she got curious and went out to see what it was, and it landed in the woods, and he came out. Well, apparently he already knew who she was and wanted her to come over there. And once she, got to know him, she went up in the ship with him, and they began to have regular rendezvous. And they were actually romantic type rendezvous, and they did fall in love, and they did have sexual intercourse a number of times. And that's not a very good drawing of what he really looked like, but she said that he had this spiky looking hair like a rock star, and his skin was kind of a light green with scales on it. And he looked like an ordinary man other than that, and then his eyes, she said, were yellow with a long black slit in it. Unfortunately, this did not have a happy ending. He got killed. Once amount of time went by, and he didn't make the usual rendezvous. And then a few weeks later, she did see the light above the trees and went down there to wait for him. And a ship landed, but 3 reptilians got out and told her that he had been killed, that his own ship had crashed, and they came back to tell her about it. And she did kind of go off the deep end after that, but that's a pretty interesting account. Now we'll go on to the next one. Wait, there's one more drawing, I guess. where I wanted or what I was talking about, that he did the best he could. Just so in the relationship. Okay, now this one is Alvin, the guy that we saw on the tape. Alvin's experience occurred in 1982, and he said what happened was first he saw a blue light. He had just come home from baseball practice, and he saw a blue light that came into the bedroom window, and he was kind of curious, so he walked over to the window and looked out, didn't see anything, so he went out on the patio. And when he got outside, he heard a kind of a humming sound, and he looked straight up and saw what looked like a gigantic stealth aircraft, and it was revolving in a 360-degree revolution, and then revolution, and it was about 100 feet off the ground. And there was a lady standing nearby, and she was pretty tall. He said she was almost 7 feet tall, and she had real pretty long, blonde, white-looking hair. And she told him not to be afraid, and if he would cooperate with her, that he would be rewarded. Well, he put his hand in hers, and then he said a kind of a blue smoke enveloped him, and the next thing he knew, he was inside the spacecraft. Now, once inside, he was given a tour of the ship, and he noticed there were at least a dozen of those same type of females there. He never saw any males. And they were all exceptionally tall. He said one of them was over 7 feet tall. They all had the real pretty white hair, and he said they were all exceptionally beautiful. They didn't look like natural women. They were just too perfect, too beautiful. They showed him a room, and it had these coffin-like structures lined up in it, and they had clear glass over them. He asked what those were. Was that their beds? And she said that those were their rejuvenation chambers. And then he was taken into the room where they were studying minerals and rock samples they picked up here on Earth, and then into another room where they had small animals, and they were performing tests on them, squirrels, rabbits, and that type of thing. And then he was taken into a room and shown some star maps, star charts. And then finally, he was taken into a lounge area where some of the women were relaxing. And he sat down and talked to the lady that had brought him on board, which, by the way, they only spoke to him telepathically. And she explained to him that they were from the Big Dipper, the second star, and the Big Dipper, the handle of it. And she said that they were just out collecting samples and collecting specimens, and that they kind of watched over some of the planets, and she knew a lot about Earth's past history, and they talked about that, and then she didn't know a lot about the culture now, and he filled her in on some of the details. And she did know about some of the things that were going to come up in the future about earthquakes and things like that were going to hit Earth. And eventually, they wound up having sex. I suppose that was his reward for, they did do a medical exam on him, by the way, and that was his reward for cooperating in that department. But I kind of thought, after studying this case, that maybe the reason that Alvin wound up having sex with the captain was because there were no males on board the ship, and she did say they had been gone for a long time from their planet. And the women on board were all flirting with him and were real happy to see a man on board. So that could be one of the reasons why they were eager to be One thing that we can learn from encounters like this is that aliens appear to have similar motivations to humans, sexual and emotional. Like I said, it doesn't always wind up this way, but that it does at all does tell us that they have some of the same passions, some of the same feelings, and some of the same interests that we do. And there are different races, the reptilians and the Nordics and other types. There's some other books out that talk about this besides mine, and a lot of them talk about the reptilians having a very big sexual interest in at least human females. I've never heard of them having sex with any males. But that could be because most of their crew members are male, so they need one Earth female. I guess now I'll just take some questions if anybody has any.
Were these women considered to be Nordic?
Yeah, because of the blonde hair and being so tall that they're classed in the Nordic type.
Two quick. Having read a little bit about some of this stuff, have you ever run across any occasion where the male had his operation, or one of the abducted females that had her tubes tied or anything? Would be the first question. And then what would have happened? Have you ever seen that as part of any literature? Yeah,
let's see, Betty Andreasen, they wrote that book, The Watchers, and the Andreasen affair, phase 1, phase 2. She had been abducted all throughout her life, and once when they abducted her to extract eggs, they were pretty horrified to find that she had had a hysterectomy. Of course, that involved the total removal of all your eggs. I'm sure that's happened every time.
But no vasectomy or anything like that?
No, I've never heard of anything about a vasectomy. I did want to mention also that when I was talking about the reptilian thing, he told her that one of the reasons why they put implants into people is because they act like a two-way TV or a two-way radio. They can hear what you're saying and they can see what you're seeing. And he said that was how they had decoded our language over a long stretch of time, by implanting people, listening to the way we would talk, and then they were able to figure out what we were saying. Also, a lot of abductees have implants in their sexual organs, in their head, in their hands, foot, leg, whatever. Maybe the ones that have them in the sex organs, they're doing a sex study on to just watch, how we do it, how often we do it, for procreation purposes.
And then the other part, anything in the literature about homosexuality?
Only one case. I'm in contact with a researcher named Don Worley, and he studies these tall Nordic types. And I'd asked him to bring in information he might have about sexual encounters, and he sent me a little bit. And there was one case of an extraterrestrial male and having a homosexual affair with a human. And this is an ongoing thing with a guy we picked up periodically. Anybody else have any?
Is conventional communication, or is communication by conventional speech as we know it?
In some cases, most people say that it's telepathic, but in the case of that reptilian, he knew English, so he spoke to her in English. It just depends on the alien, I guess.
Cynthia, is there any indication that these sexual encounters with aliens are possible because of some of the legends? Second, especially most of these aliens are very attractive, but the second one kind of looks demonic. And of course, since the Middle Ages, there have been legends of demonic possessions, especially incubi and succubi, which are demonic beings that come into the night at night usually and have sexual relationships with human beings.
I did talk about that. I did talk about that in my book. I do believe that could account for a lot of that went on during the Middle Ages and probably still goes on. That some of those incubus and succubus were invisible, and some of the people that are reporting this, a lot of these cases came from the 1970s, especially the ones involving the co-eds, and a lot of the times the being was invisible. So back in those days, a lot of it was being attributed to succubus or incubus, but the fact that they saw a UFO before it happened makes me think that it was probably an extraterrestrial type thing. But that, like you said, probably does account a lot for that behavior going on in the past. And like the fairies and the changelings, back a long time ago, the people over in Ireland and such were saying that their babies were being taken off by these little people and exchanged, and they would bring back one and they were supposed to raise that one. Some ufologists believe now that those were little hybrid babies, and that those were probably aliens, maybe those little gray types that people were seeing and they were called spirits. Any more questions?
So what has anybody done any studies like how many species there are and what kind of the percentages, I mean, like, you always hear about the grades quite a bit, but
Yeah.
we'll talk about them and all. But the Nordics fairly rare.
No, the Nordics are not rare. They're, as a matter of fact, they're almost as prevalent as the grays. And from my research, it shows that those little gray aliens work for those taller ones. And a lot of people get confused because they don't see the taller ones. But I'm in communication with the guy that was abducted by the little grays numerous times. And eventually, one of the taller Nordic type blondes came in while this was going on. And Travis Walton, remember Fire in the Sky? He was abducted by the little gray types. And then, now this wasn't in the movie because they wouldn't put it in there, but I have some old UFO magazines that talk about these stories. Once he was taken in and examined, a taller extraterrestrial male that looked like one of those Nordic types actually escorted him out of the spacecraft because he was breaking things up in there trying to get away. But they left that out of the Hollywood version because I guess it was not exciting enough for her.
In your biblical research, you found history of biblical passages.
Oh, yes. In my other 3 books, this book I mainly just kind of wrote for fun, but in my other book, in Genesis 6:1-4, we did the first time that any hybridization took place, when it says the sons of the deities came down from heaven, and they took the daughters of men, whomever they chose, and they had sexual relations with them, and then children were born of those. And if you look at the Hebrew word for Nephilim, which is giant, there are 2 forms of that word. One form of it is divided by yod in the middle of the little Hebrew character that looks like that. That designated a child that came from those Nephilim. In other words, that was a hybrid. When you saw that, you knew that was half human, half Nephilim. And then the other phase of the word meant strictly one of those beings that had come down from heaven. So that's the first case, and if you look all through the Bible, there are numerous cases. Moses was a hybrid. You have to look in the New Testament to see this talk. It talks about how he was divinely beautiful, and in other words, he looked like one of them because they had very striking features, the real white hair and the real fair skin. And then Noah was one. If you look at the book of Enoch, it gives a real good description of what he looked like. He had the pure white hair, real white skin, and his eyes gave off light so much that whenever he was born, the whole house lit up on the inside, and he was actually projecting an aura, which was another characteristic of the deity of the Old Testament and the angels. And even Jesus Christ, they manifest an aura. So they're all in the Bible, hybrids. Samson, I believe, is one. And also the legends, like the Greek legends and such. Hercules, his father, I believe, was Zeus. And then Gilgamesh, who was a Sumerian hero of an epic poem, he was 3 parts Nephilim or God, and then 1 part human. So he was definitely a hybrid. He was always upset because he was going to have to die and suffer the fate of a mortal.
What about the Immaculate Conception?
That, well, I believe that Jesus Christ is probably a hybrid because he has, his father is from heaven, his mother is from earth. And it's in vitro fertilization, obviously. The mother was a virgin and everything. A lot of research has been done on that, and I've talked about that extensively in my book, Born in Heaven.
One of the things is the use of the word Alvin.
So what?
The use of the word Alvin. When they do the translations in the Bible and all, they don't mean that Mary was a virgin. It's due to a translation there.
Well, I've heard that unmarried, look at the customs of the Hebrews in those times, unmarried females did not have sex because they were stoned to death if they got caught doing that. So, and she also served in the temple. That's in extra biblical writings. Highly unlikely she would have an opportunity
Some
to do anything like
people think
that.
that she was married to Joseph too, if they were already married.
Well, a betrothal in those days was a marriage. It just was an unconsummated marriage. Once you were betrothed, you belonged to your husband or whatever, and they weren't in the custom of doing anything else. Anything else?
Has anyone ever heard of or examined a human baby suspected to be a hybrid?
Yeah, I talked about that in my book. There's a doctor out in California that supposedly this lady was pregnant, had been abducted, was really traumatized. She claimed to have been raped, and there are some cases of actual rape that I talked about in my book. And when the baby was born from that encounter, it was a dubious mixed breeding. And the doctor put that in his report and everything. I don't know what happened to the body on that.
Relating to the Bible code, we talked about possible futures, and I think one of the things it talks about is an asteroid hitting the Earth. Has any of the abductees or anything talked about any time?
Yes, they have, and I talk about that in all three of my books. I talk about the possibility of an asteroid and what the catalyst is for it. And I believe it's the planet that those beings come from, the Viru, that's stitching right about. And it goes through the asteroid belt, could dislodge some there, and it also passes through the Oort cloud and can drag debris along with it. It displaces things that are already out there. Well, according to my calculations, it will be back in 2060 AD because the last time it was here was in 1640 BC. That was the time of the Hebrew Exodus, and if you look in Exodus, the plagues and the phenomenon, celestial phenomenon that were taking place then point towards the passing of a large body with a strong gravitational attraction into Earth's vicinity. Now, if you look at the book of Revelation, which is the last thing that happened in the end time, you see that same exact scenario being laid out. So it is highly probable that Revelation will transpire real soon, the events in there. And with the opening of the Bible code, that does indicate that we are in the end times because that was one of the triggering mechanisms, opening of the first seal, and it has an opening with the Bible code. Any more questions?
It seems to me that the men here who have sex with these aliens look at it as a gift, the women look at it as being raped.
No, not all the women look at it as being raped, and only a few cases of that. Well, I don't know what to say about the men, how they feel about it. I mean, men are men, but...
That's right. That's the point I guess I'm making it.
Well, now the lady, the reptilian affair, she was absolutely in love with that guy, and she did not look at that as being raped at all.
I mean, were these men actually given choices up there, or were they just kind of taken because something stimulated them against their will?
I don't think you can ever stimulate one against their will, but they apparently, I've never heard of that. They apparently do have them in a state of susceptibility. They've been hypnotically or whatever. All abductees say that they're in some kind of a mental state where they can't make decisions for themselves. They're under someone else's influence. This could have something to do with their implants if they have them. They may just push a button somewhere that says, okay, now you'll do whatever we say. I don't know. But the men, like Antonio Villas Boas, he did feel like he had been used because they did come to the conclusion that this was for breeding purposes. But he said that he did enjoy it. Now, he said also that he would not prefer that little lady over a human female because he couldn't talk to her. Those aliens talked in a succession of what sounded like barks to him. And he wanted somebody that he could communicate with, verbalize with, and have a relationship. And obviously that was a one-night stand.
What was your candid opinion when you interviewed the truck stop lady?
I thought she had a vivid imagination, and she had done a lot of reading, but when she got into some of the physics involved, it would be impossible for her to glean this from any type of publication. It was too detailed.
She got a school background or anything?
She was a little hick from out in the country, working the truck stop, and no education. And she's spouting out stuff that getting into hyperdimensional physics. And as deep as she got into explaining how these things work, she had this
Yeah, and by her behavior after it was over with, she kind of went crazy because he was dead. So if nothing happened, she wouldn't have reacted that way. Is your question?
I'm sorry, we missed the first part. Did these people that, the men, did they know that they knew that it was aliens? They were aware of that?
Well, they were abducted and taken into a spacecraft, so
They were.
I would say they would be aware of that.
But I was wondering if the aliens, as I've heard before, that the aliens can make you think that maybe you're an ex-husband or you're maybe a beautiful movie star type looking person, and the person thinks that that's who they're having sex with, when they're actually maybe a gray or
Yeah, in my research, I did come across some instances where people thought that they were having intercourse with what they thought was a beautiful man or woman, but then somewhere, somehow, they would wake up and realize that it was some other type of alien, like a reptilian or a little gray type, and some of them even said those mantis-looking bugs. So, yeah, they have our suggestion.
It's not a match whiskey, is it?
They probably needed some after they got back to the Anybody else have anything to know?
Any incidents of sexually transmitted disease?
Unfortunately, there was a case that occurred back in the 70s. This was a young woman who was driving home and was abducted, taken on board a ship, and the creatures that she said had a hold of her looked like they were wearing Halloween costumes. They had all these white glowing suits, and she never saw anything but just their eyes. It was some kind of a little band that they were looking through. And they did a medical exam on her, and then eventually they did have sexual intercourse with her, and then they left her back in the yard at her house. The next day, she felt uncomfortable and went to the doctor, and he did discover that she had some kind of an infection that can be transmitted sexually, and it has to do with a bladder infection type thing. They didn't specify the name of it, but anyway, that's fairly a common thing. And she got mad at her husband at first because she thought he might have given it to her, but then maybe that's what happened. But something funny that John Morley told me is that a lot of times when people are abducted, they're taken off, taken up to the ship, whatever, in one set of clothes and returned in another. And he said a real funny one happened when this man was abducted and he was wearing a t-shirt and underwear and he was asleep and everything. He was brought back in a woman's red negligee. I would love to know what he told his wife when she woke up and saw him laying there in that. Don't tell him what transpired.
It needs to be transported back.
But clothes being mixed up like that is real common in the abduction scenario. One guy woke up and he had a t-shirt on that had Japanese writing on it. So he must have really wondered what happened during the night because he didn't have that on when he went to bed.
What was the source of the radiation burns? Was that
From
propulsion system or just
I don't
being
know.
around the people? Or
I don't know.
how many people get radiation burns?
Some people do get radiation burn. It could happen after getting into the craft because, from what I understand, heat comes off the bottom of this craft. There have been times that someone had a UFO hovering over their house, and then the next day they would see their yard was all dehydrated and yellow, and there was some radiation there. So I would imagine that it comes out of the craft, and when they're getting in and out of the craft, they get it somehow. Maybe the aliens have something on that absorbs the radiation. It doesn't hurt them. I don't know. Anything else?
I came in late, so you may have already covered this, but what do you get an agenda on why they would be having? Now, I understand, like, when they're doing hybrids or they're interacting with hybrids, but what about, like, when you're talking about, like, grays or having sex with grays or reptilians? Are they just having their jollies, or are they actually trying to create a race?
I'll tell you what I think happens some of the time, anyway. I know this is probably what happened here. I think that these expeditions, they come from far away. They may be out for years going to different planets. In some cases, they're all-male crews. That's usually the case. This was the first time I'd ever heard of an all-female crew. You don't have the sexes on board to interact. They obviously can't have sex. The reptilians supposedly have a base here on Earth, and as you can imagine, if they were here for a long period of time, had no access to females, and here's all these Earth women around, I think it's natural. I think they would do what our guys do when they're in the military and they go overseas. Oh, those other women start looking real good, you know, so they're going to go for it. I think that's what part of it is anyway.
Now, the thing that you just said about the Reptilians having a base here, outside of some of the channel material that I think you are marching at and others, where did you get that information from?
That has been in several books that I've read. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but there is supposed to, Area 51, I think it's supposed to be a place where they have a base. In some of the writings I've read where people have actually seen the reptilians on the base there at Area 51. And somebody had told me that there was one someplace in Mexico.
The Area 51 has been closed down. Have you heard that?
No. When did that happen?
No, there's been a movie called
Right.
They moved it up to Utah.
Let's just say this, as that base was in operation, so also the aliens had a base there.
Just out of Third Way.
So what you're saying then is they were working with the government?
I think that they could be working with the government to a certain degree. I do believe there's a huge UFO cover-up by the government.
Right. And how much of the alien abduction and sexual hybrid do you think the government is involved in?
I think they're involved in all of it. Just something I read just last night. There was an incident where a UFO flap went over a city. This was back in the 60s. And one of the people who had gone through some hypnotic regression therapy remembered having like a bloody nose and being abducted and everything. And then she also remembered that the next day after this was over with, government doctors came along and were knocking on the doors in all the neighborhoods and said they were there because of some bacterial contamination in the water and they needed to do blood tests on everyone in the house. And to me, that seems kind of strange that that happened right after a UFO sighting, and this woman remembers being abducted, and by the way, hers was reptilian, and they wanted to do a blood test, so, you know, they never came back again, but maybe they were just looking to see if anybody had any genetic changes or anything put into them or whatever. But the evidence is out there, and it's like a big puzzle. There's a lot of little pieces here and there, and you read a lot of this stuff and start putting two and two together, it adds up.
Cynthia, this book here, the one you're doing your talk on, I know you're selling it for $20, but is this the second revision?
No,
This is the original?
That's the only one I wrote that. I wrote that one, really I just wrote this book because the other stuff I do is real heavy, real involved. I have to do a lot of research on it and everything. I needed to get away from the mind-boggling stuff a little bit and have some fun, so I wrote this one, and that's how I got on Strange Universe and did a whole bunch of radio.
Well, you'll let us know whenever your book comes out so we can, you know.
Oh, yeah, I'll let y'all know when my Bible, the Bible and Extraterrestrial Transmission comes out. It's at the printer now. There's 500 copies of it being printed up, and those are just author copies that are going out to radio and TV shows and stuff. And after that, hopefully I'll have a real big publisher. Anybody else have any questions about sexual encounters?
What is